Arcades in the 90s. Boy, what a fun time for gamers that was. So what happened to it? Well, there's a few popular answers to that question, but the one I tend to go with is that home consoles caught up to the games you'd find at the arcades. So as soon as you could play arcade quality games at home, you didn't have to leave your house anymore. And if there's one thing that's been proven time and again, it's that if you give the people the option to not leave their house, they will take that option every time. Every time. Every time. You see, for a while, home consoles weren't as advanced as the hardware you'd find inside arcade machines. So you'd often see arcade games with ports to the home consoles which were technically inferior in some way or another. Now, certain ports were better than others, and the games that fared the best were generally the ones that added something new, or in some cases just remade the game with the console hardware in mind. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is a good example of this. Anyways, the arcade games were not only often technically superior, but also came out earlier than whatever ports would eventually be made. And that way, the arcades were kind of like the movie theater. You'd go to see the big new releases and then have to wait for a home version to become available later down the line. And in the 90s, advertising wasn't as widespread as it is nowadays, so there's a good chance you could go to the arcade and see something new that you'd never heard of before, that could potentially end up being one of your favorite games. The arcades were also a great way to test your skills against other players in certain games. Street Fighter II is what really got this started, but then you had games like Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, and many others. You'd often find lines of people waiting to get a turn on some of these games, often utilizing a play till you lose system. Some kids could milk a quarter for a long time if they kept beating people, whereas others would wait in a big line only to get their butt whooped and then just have to get right back in line. So you can see the incentive of getting better at a game. A lot of weird unwritten rules were in place at the arcades as well. Like, you could rest your quarters on the machine to signify you had the next game, and then there was even stuff like no throwing allowed in Street Fighter because it was considered cheap. The arcades were also very popular for light gun games. These games would often have these really substantial light guns you could use, and the home console counterparts usually weren't as high of quality. This Sega Saturn one that I have here is alright though. The other type of game that couldn't be easily replicated at home were driving games. These games would often have a steering wheel, gear shift, brake and gas pedals, and sometimes even a seat all built into the machine. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This is all some pretty heavy-duty equipment to have just for a single game. I mean, some of these arcade cabinets could weigh up to 300 pounds or more. Certainly not as efficient as a home console that only weighed a few pounds and could play multiple games. So, as you might be able to guess, these giant cabinets weren't cheap either. As a result, they needed to eat a lot of quarters out of people's pockets to be a viable business asset for these arcade owners. You did see stuff like the Neo Geo, which used swappable cartridges much like a home console would, but you've still got a giant arcade machine as part of the equation. By this point, you can probably see where this is headed. As soon as these machines couldn't make enough money, they'd start to die off, and that's exactly what happened. But hold on a second. There's still some arcade games around today, aren't there? Well, yeah, but most of what you see is stuff where you can win tickets to use for prizes. Which is stupid if you ask me, because these types of games are basically designed like gambling machines. I mean, they're designed to make a profit and there's not much in the way of gameplay, especially compared to how arcade games used to be. But kids started being trained to expect tickets when they played a game, and now that's the norm. And you gotta win so many tickets just to get anything halfway decent. Anyways, once that became the dominant form of arcade game, that was it for the old stuff. Games looked just as good on the home consoles by that point, and there just wasn't enough desire from people to want to play these games at a place like an arcade. So, arcades as they existed in the 90s remain a relic of the past. You can still find some places that have preserved these machines, but they are few and far between. Okay, so for this week's video, I want everybody to share their favorite memories of the arcade days. Seriously, I always love hearing these kinds of stories. So make sure to share yours, and I will see ya in the next video.